You're listening to Workplace Perspective, an employment law podcast presented by Sapphire Legal. Workplace Perspective is a regular podcast series for employers and employees focusing on education, training, and the law to help organizations of all sizes develop and maintain successful workplace relationships. The opinions expressed by guests on Workplace Perspective do not necessarily reflect those of Sapphire Legal or its attorneys and should not be considered legal advice. And now, here's your host, founder and principal attorney at Sapphire Legal, Teresa McQueen.
Thank you, James, and welcome everyone to Workplace Perspective, where we are striving to raise the bar at workplaces everywhere. Today, we're talking with author, speaker, trainer, Anthony Casablanca. Anthony is a co-author of the book, The Dying Art of Leadership. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking with Anthony about how leaders can, and why they should, help grieving and emotionally traumatized employees excel at work. I'm really excited to hear his thoughts on this important topic. It's going to be a great show. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
The opinions expressed by guests on Workplace Perspective do not necessarily reflect those of Sapphire Legal or its attorneys and should not be considered legal advice. You're listening to Workplace Perspective, an employment law podcast presented by Sapphire Legal.
Welcome back to our listeners, and welcome to Workplace Perspective, Anthony Casablanca.
Well, hi, Teresa. Thanks so much for having me on the show. It's my privilege.
I'm super excited. I think this is a really, really interesting topic. But before we get started and I get distracted, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, spent 31 years in various leadership roles over up until 2015 when I ultimately retired. Throughout those years, those leadership roles included senior positions, right? So the last decade or so, I was vice president of human resources and the vice president of supply chain and a president of an operating company. And all through those years, I consistently engaged with people whose lives and life stories would just stop me in my tracks and just amaze me what they were dealing with. And I realized that as part of my leadership responsibility, or part of the responsibilities of a leader, is to understand those things and take those things into consideration as they lead, and actually provide avenues for people to talk about those things. And so over the course of my leadership, I constantly sort of continued to develop my ability to show respect for people and so forth. And I'm going to go off track just a little bit here because my brother is a co-author. And so he spent his time in funeral service. And so he's dealing with emotionally traumatized and grieving people on a daily basis, hundreds of them a year. In fact, maybe even thousands of them a year. And so a couple of years ago after I retired, we decided that, there's nothing available to leaders in this space. And we've both had experiences that we thought we could share. And so we came together and we wrote the book, The Dying Art of Leadership, and we started a training company called Grief Leaders, which is really sort of a one-of-a-kind company in that we're the only leadership training company that's sole focus is around helping leaders gain the confidence and skills required to help grieving employees, emotionally traumatized employees, excel at work. So that's sort of a quick little synopsis of 31 years of history.
Well, I appreciate that. Appreciate that briefness. But I think it's interesting when you talk about grieving or traumatized employees. I think the dying art of leadership and your background and all that leads people, I think, to believe that you're just simply talking about those that are grieving over a particular loss. But it's more than that, right? You're talking about employees who are not only grieving, but they have experienced trauma in that regard. So can you tell us exactly sort of what that encompasses, or when you say grieving employees, what are you talking about?
Sure. That's a great question, Teresa. We spend a fair amount of time in our book and on our leadership training programs getting leaders. One of the critical points that we want leaders to walk away from our training with is that grief is not just the death of a loved one. Any emotionally traumatic event that is significant enough to cause the person to feel that their reality is being altered is enough to trigger a grief response in them. And so when you broaden it to that perspective, things like divorce and a significant illness diagnosis of either the individual or a family member, opioid addiction, the list kind of goes on and on and on, including, and oftentimes this gets overlooked, including a company's own initiatives will cause employees to enter the stages of grief. And oftentimes, in that regard, their grieving, in quotes, gets misconstrued or gets perceived as a resistance to change, when in reality it's not. They're just going through the stages of grief. So we're talking about something much broader than just the loss of a loved one. That's certainly a piece of it, but anything that alters a person's sense of reality can cause them to grieve if it's significant enough. And it's a pretty big deal. I mean, studies have estimated that this costs U.S. companies $75 billion a year in lost productivity.
Wow, that's huge.
It is huge. And that those same studies would indicate that up to 1 in 4 people are showing up to work right now, today, in some stage of grief. So it is huge. It's huge. And it is largely an unaddressed portion of leadership that, organizations tend to think that, that's stuff that happens outside of work. So, we shouldn't deal with it, and we should just sort of suck it up. And if it is something that's being driven by work, get over it, because that's what we get paid to do, right? And the reality is that's not how it really works. And if you leave it unaddressed, you will pay more than your fair share in lost productivity.
Well, I really think that's interesting. I want to go back to 2 things you said. One, the grief response, so the stages of grief. I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I want to focus a little bit on these company processes, because I think that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about the grief response, can you tell us what you mean by that? What does that entail?
Yeah.
In a workplace context, of course.
Yeah. So and I think if I'm misinterpreting your question, please let me know, and I'll rethink my answer here. But when a person enters the stages of grief, right, we're talking about the classical denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance stages of grief, right? Grief is, you can't turn it off, right? You can't check it at the door. You can't leave it at home. And with the way life is today, people are working from home, so it's even more complicated, right? And so you can't turn it off. It impacts what you do at work. You become distracted. You become careless because you're distracted. You become lethargic, right? You don't really want to be doing what you're doing, depending on how emotional the event is. I can tell you, when our son was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, the last thing I wanted to do was go to work. Yeah. Fortunately, I was retired and was able to spend time with him and help him through the treatments and all of those things to help him stay productive. But, at the end of the day, he was going to work every day with that hanging over his head and showing up and dealing with the treatments and the side effects. And you just can't leave that stuff outside of the work environment. And oftentimes, leaders do not recognize what's going on. What they see is performance is suffering, and they address the performance problem. And they never really try to understand what's going on and what's behind that performance problem. And when you do that, unfortunately, that just compounds the problem, right? That makes the grief even more complex, because now the person feels their job is in jeopardy.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about that, that's what we're really talking about. Did that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. That sort of aspect. What I think is, because I think that's important to note. I think, and that's where I connect the leadership issue.
Right.
Because there's all kinds of things about accommodating employees who have issues and need time off to treat whatever it might be, if it's if it's something that needs to be accommodated. But these are things that I think that leadership tends to shy away from having anything to do with those kinds of conversations, because they're afraid of the answer. So I always counsel employees, you don't want to talk about the details. Don't talk about what's, I see something, I recognize this red flag behavior. Something's going on, like performance is going down. You're distracted. I think you're little, so what do you need and how can we provide it? Is the employer a proper response? That's all you really have to say. But so many people are afraid to do that. So they ignore the conversation altogether, unless it's something obvious that the employee's like, had an accident or I got to have surgery. I need the time off. So I think that's really interesting. But this idea of the company processes, or I think that's how you said it, but steps that the company takes, bringing on this grieving process. So I think that's really interesting. I used to work for, it used to be the MGM Grand Hotel in Reno.
Yes.
Big to do. And so even this was years after that, you had employees still walking around saying, boy, when this was the MGM Grand, it was this. And the same thing, I worked at Harrah's, and it was all about, well, when Bill Harrah was alive, it was this way.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about now, it's like, yeah, that is grief. It's like they never got over it.
Right. They did not. And actually, every time those hotels change hands, that will be a trigger for them, and they will relive it all over again.
I just think that never even occurred to me. I just thought, I did the same thing. I'm like, oh, get over it.
Right.
Like it's new. It's a new process.
Get into this century, right? So let me give you a real example, right? What's one of those things that I learned from that impacted us and the path we're on now and writing the book. I mean, I had when I was in human resources, I had the assignment of shutting down a plant in the Northeast, 192 people. And fortunately, I was working for a very aggressive, progressive human resource leader who innately got this, right? This is who he was as an individual. So I learned a great deal from him. So the organization wanted to just like not announce till we were ready to close the plant, and let's watch the costs and all those kinds of things.
Hello, Warren Act.
Yeah, exactly, right. And myself and this HR leader said, no, that's not how we're going to treat our people. That's not how we're going to treat our people. We're going to give them a year's notice. We're going to do what's right by them from a benefits perspective. We will pay them retention bonuses. We will provide them with outplacement. We're going to do all kinds of things. And oh, by the way, Anthony, me, is going to travel up there every week. We plotted 100, and we were going to tell everybody within 24 hours in person in their native language.
Wow. About
what their benefits were going to be. So we knew they understood. And there were 7 languages spoken in the plant.
Wow.
And so we did all of this, and my head was spinning because I was like, how are we going to get through 192 people in 24 hours? That's crazy. We did it. And we plotted all 192 people on the graph that it was actually contained in our book. And my role was to fly up there every week and identify, based on that graph, the people who were likely to be most impacted and whose reality was going to be changed the most significantly, and make sure that we focused on them and helped them through this. And it was such a beautiful way to transition the organization in the plant. And we had 2,300 other people outside of that plant who were watching how we did this.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. Fortunately, all 192 people either had a job or retired from the organization when we were done. And people think, well, that was really nice. That must have been expensive. Well, maybe, but that plant hit every single monthly safety goal, productivity goal, revenue goal, every goal we had right up until the last employee left the building. So from a business perspective, whatever it cost us was far outweighed by the business results. There was no sabotage. There was no shutdown, right? There was nobody getting hurt. But people were grieving. And one of the things that I learned was when we announced it, people who had been through a plant shutdown before brought their plant shutdown, previous plant shutdown up and was like,
yep,
this is unbelievable. I didn't think I'd ever have, right? It was a visceral reaction to the announcement. But those same people became great champions for us because they were able to say, let me tell you what happened to me 5 years ago. And this company does not have to do what they're doing. And so we all should be really grateful that they're treating us this way. And they became great stabilizers in the process.
I think that is absolutely amazing because I always talk about, we're big believers, about it's how you treat the employees. Mm-hmm. It's how you manage the situation. You can have difficult conversations and you can have traumatic events in the workplace.
Yep.
It's how you handle it. And that far outweighs, those people weren't running out to attorneys to say, well, are they following the Warren Act? Are they doing what they're supposed to? Are they doing all these things? Because you've already answered all those questions and you've already been mindful of that for whatever reason. And right. I think it's absolutely amazing. And it did probably help those people, to deal with their past trauma and to sort of minimize what they were going through at the time. It was an awesome story. I see we're at our halfway, so we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Anthony. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
The average time a resume spends on an HR manager's desk is 7 seconds, and most of them are tossed aside. Now imagine if one of those resumes belonged to Yasmin, who was
living in a shelter, juggling 3 jobs. I had to be resilient. That's something that you can't teach.
Or if that resume was from someone who
worked 12-hour shifts at the recycling company with my dad, who's 72. That taught me a work ethic that I carry with me every day.
We rely so much on a resume, yet it could never tell the full story of someone.
Growing up where I did, a lot of things could have gotten in the way of my goals. But I learned to push through, and that's what I bring to work every day.
So maybe it's time we look beyond the resume and look to Grads of Life. Discover new ways to develop great talent that are so much more than what's on paper at gradsoflife.org. A public service announcement brought to you by Grads of Life and the Ad Council.
If you enjoyed today's show,
How do you continue to drive predictable revenue
like us,
in an increasingly
give us a review on your favorite podcast app. It sure means a lot to us, and it ensures that more people tune in and raise the bar at workplaces everywhere.
Welcome back, everyone. We are talking with Anthony Casablanca about the importance of recognizing the special challenges facing grieving workers. Anthony, you refer to grief leadership as one of the most awkward leadership challenges. I thought that was great. Tell me more about why you term it that way.
Sure. Because it is, right? It's one of the most awkward, uncomfortable, emotional pieces of leadership. And it's because our culture has not done a very good job of conditioning us to this, right? We've all probably run into somebody in the grocery store who, they've got something going on in their lives for, whatever it is, something truly emotionally traumatic for them. And you think, oh my gosh, I hope they didn't see me because I don't want to talk to them. I don't know what to say to them. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm going to walk the store backwards in the hope that I don't actually, have to run into them. And frankly, I'm guilty of that myself, even today, even having written the book and doing the leadership training. It's very uncomfortable. And it's because our culture as a nation, we don't deal well with this, right? We're sort of hey, get over it. Life's going to be better, right? We have all kinds of excuses for why things happen and should have happened and how things are always going to be better. You'll learn from this and all those other kinds of things, right? Leaders are never exposed to this in training of any kind, right? This is not taught in any business school. This is not taught by any leadership companies until now. It's just been an overlooked part of leadership. And it's because we've so narrowly defined grief in the past, right? It's been defined as the loss of a loved one.
Right.
And a very obvious thing, right? And it's so much broader than that. And then organizations really don't have processes in place to deal with an emotionally traumatized employee. And frankly, the more high performance an organization you portray yourself as, regardless of how the C-suite leaders want the organization to behave, the culture has probably sent a message that if somebody raises their hand and says, hey, I'm struggling, that's perceived as a sign of weakness. Mm-hmm. And it comes back to haunt them at another time in their career, right? And so for all of those reasons, leaders just avoid this, right? And it is very awkward. I admit that. It is a very awkward conversation to have with people. And, it's a balance. You got to balance when you are crossing a line, because we're talking about personal things here.
Right, which is why people get
feelings, and that always makes people creepy, right? So,
yeah, and then there's the issue, especially for California employers, we're very concerned about getting too much information and what that could lead to and all that. Not that right. You got to have those conversations. I'm with you. You got to have it. There's easy ways to do it. So let's talk about that. So leaders who witness these kind of red flag behaviors that you talked about, what's the most effective way to address it?
Sure.
I'm sure that's not a short answer, but I just, Well,
right. So without going into, 8 hours of grief leadership, we would offer up these things, right? So first and foremost, the leader has to himself or herself be willing to be vulnerable, right? If the leader's not willing to be vulnerable, their people will never be vulnerable either. Part of that vulnerability is actually engaging, being willing to cast aside your fears and actually engage in the conversation, right? Not about the performance. You can certainly talk about what you're observing, but typically couched in a fashion of, help me understand what's going on, because I'm witnessing these things, mm-hmm. and that doesn't seem to be you, right? So tell me what's going on. Your job's not in jeopardy. I'm just really concerned about you. Help me understand, is there anything going on in your life, either here at work or outside, because the organization wants to help. And then when you have that conversation, right, you have to listen more than you talk, but you have to be willing to adjust your leadership style after you've had the conversation. It doesn't do any good to have that conversation and then end it with, well, just suck it up because, you got to get better, right? Or, hey, you're going to learn from this. Life is going to get better. I know it's a tough time right now, right? But hey, you're going to come to some glorious learning point in the future that's going to change who you are as a person. You'll be better for this. If that's where you go with this, it's all wasted, right? So you have to be willing to adjust your leadership style and actually think about how could you support this person as an organization and as a leader. And then the last one, which people are very, very afraid of, and it aggravates me to no end because it's just an excuse, is involve the rest of the team. The rest of the team wants to help, but doesn't know how. Right? Now, you don't have to go back and say, well, let me tell you what, boy, you wouldn't believe. Let's get a cup of coffee because we're going to talk about all the crap that's going on in Teresa's life, right?
Because that's going to get you in trouble.
That'll get you in trouble, right? But to come back to the team and say, hey, look, Teresa's going through some pretty difficult things right now, and we need to help her through this. And so here's how I want to adjust the behavior of the organization, right? I need you to take on more of Teresa's responsibility. We need to be cognizant that Teresa may call in sick at the spur of the moment because of some of the things she's dealing with because she needs time off. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to have to we're going to have to muster up the resources to support her for a period of time. Those are all fine I haven't violated any HIPAA rules by having that conversation. And the team will be like, oh my God, we knew something was going on. Thank God we'll be able to help her. Sure, I'll go to that meeting for her, or I'll take that project, or I'll be whatever. The team wants to help. They just need to be led and shown how, and they will. Every time I have seen that play out, trust, loyalty, engagement, productivity, all go up, not only with the person, but with the entire team. Because they realize that the leader, whether the organization does or not, at least their leader cares about who they are as a person.
Yeah, and I think that's important. In California, we're heavily legislated, and when it comes to employee interaction, and a lot of those things that you're talking about, a lot of that's kind of legislated, in California with regard to, if you have that conversation, if you notice those behaviors and you have that conversation with the employee that says, so I'm noticing this performance issue. Like you said, it's not really you. So what do you need and how can we provide it? And even in that way, you're maintaining, you're not asking for I don't want the details. I don't need to know the details, because all I want to do is help you through whatever it is you're going through. Right. And how can we do that? So engaging in this interactive process to find out, is there, what you had said, like a reasonable accommodation? Mm-hmm. Do you need a reduced schedule? Are you going to need intermittent leave at some point? We're going to accept that. We're going to take a few things off your plate. We're going to help you out a little bit. Right. So all those things are an effective way to comply with the law here in California. Mm-hmm. And also do what you're saying, show the team, because you don't have to, you can maintain confidentiality, in that regard, to say, because for California, there's a lot of labor code issues about keeping medical information confidential in an employment situation. Uh-huh. And so you can do that kind of the way you're talking about. You don't need to go to the team and say, this is going on, this is what's happening. You say, this is what we're going to do. Right. And we're pulling together as a team, and this is what we're going to do for the time, for the time being. So yeah, I think that's really awesome. I think that's really great. I like the concept. Flows with all what I like. California law, which I love. Yeah. Not treating people with consideration, respect, honesty. I think it's great. I love how all those things go together. So in our last few minutes to wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or some tips for our listeners to assist them in meeting sort of this unique leadership challenge?
So, yeah, I'll leave you with, it's really not a story, but I'll leave you with a couple of things. Number one, certainly we have lots of content out on our website, and so folks can go there and choose articles to read and videos to watch and those kinds of things. But I want to leave you with this thought, and it's actually referenced in the final pages of our book. I had the privilege of hearing a gentleman by the name of Colonel Arthur Athens speak on two occasions, and he's a retired Marine colonel, and he teaches leadership training at the U.S. Naval Academy, right? And he talks about the 3 C's of leadership, and those 3 C's are competence, courage, and compassion. And he says that those three traits are something everybody in the organization, those above you and those below you, are looking to you to answer 3 questions around those traits. Competence, is the leader competent in what they're doing, or are they working really hard to get better at it or to learn their job? Courage, does the leader have the courage to do what's right, even if there is some negative consequences that would flow back to them, right? And courage, or compassion, and the question there is, does the leader care as much about me as they do themselves? And those 3 things just really resonated with me when I heard him speak. And I would challenge everyone who's listening, is that how you're leading, right? Do you have the courage to do what's right, even if there's some negative consequences to you personally? And do you have the compassion to care as much about your people as you do yourself? So I would recommend that folks go out and search Colonel Arthur Athens, and he's got a video out on YouTube that is called "What Does Love Have to Do with It?" What's love got to do with it? And it's actually a capstone talk that he gave to a leadership class, a graduating class at the U.S. Naval Academy. It's well worth the time to watch that video. So that's what I would leave with, because that's really what we try to teach at Grief Leaders, is within the realm of this topic, how do leaders act with competence, courage, and compassion?
That's great. Thank you so much for being on the show today. That's our show, everyone. We so appreciate you being on and sharing your expertise with our listeners. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
You can learn more about Anthony by visiting Grief Leaders' website at www.griefleaders.com. That's GRIEFLEADERS.com. You can also connect with Anthony via our website at sapphirelegal.com/podcast. I want to thank our listeners, my radio angels, James and the Knave at Night, our workplace team extraordinaire, our engineer producer, Paul Roberts, our associate producer, Melissa DeLacey, with music provided by the very talented Stephen Vercelloni. So until next time, everyone, thank you for joining us. Keep raising the bar.